Invasion Audiobook, Part 16. The Raging Inferno, both literal and in terms of the raw, non-stop combat throughout the city, took a heavy toll on defender and civilian, and even began to chisel away at certain invading units. Some more than others, as the defenders in the city fought hard not merely in the defense of the regime, but for their very own lives as well. Already on day one, going into the second day of the overall invasion, Trojan shock forces of the Sino-Russian coalition had totally neutralized the outlying installations that ringed the metro area of the cap city. Just prior to proceeding into the city's outermost suburbs themselves, even going so far in that even before the end of day one, had breached the city limits of the cap city itself. Just before all invading forces rushed, or all available forces rushed to plug the gaps in the line to put a stop to lead elements of the two breaching PLA battalions that had managed to proceed that far in on day one. Likewise, in the southwest portion of the metro area, across the Potomac River, the Pakistani 17th Lancers Armored Regiment, a somewhat small but a very potent fighting force in the area, had established its headquarters with its three independent companies consisting of a headquarters company, a regimental support company, and of course a security company, namely for the protection of the other two, in the city of Manassas, just outside the metro area of the Cap. This, as four of their combat battalions rushed into the southwestern suburbs, before then striking further northeast towards the Potomac in three main prongs, mainly to strike against three key objectives set according to their invasion plans. By the end of day one, they'd pushed American paramilitary elements at the CIA headquarters all the way back to the riverbanks, forcing their backs to it, literally. With also the mixed military that had been fought earlier in the day in the city of Arlington, pushed then into a battle for the National Cemetery Heights in order for their self-propelled guns of their two mechanized infantry battalions, artillery pieces, or artillery batteries, respectively, each battalion having one artillery battery apiece. This in order to rain artillery shells across the river, as well as onto the American DoD itself at its headquarters building, the monolithic Pentagon. With the third prong striking towards the national airport along the river of the Potomac, as well as helping also to pincer the DoD on its northwestern part in a bulging line facing due north to face also both the airport and Defense Department's massive headquarters building. Also on day one, the PLA's 31st Group Army's subunits had taken the international airport just beyond the metro area, all the way out at Leesburg, Virginia, for use as a mega FOB, or a mega forward operations base, for the later coming occupation operations, as well as working their way into the metro area, seeking weak spots to break through and exploit the said breakthroughs. Even one of the 93rd Infantry Division's 16 battalions crossed the I-495 highway, also called the Beltway, into the Alexandria area, ostensibly to give support to their Pakistani allies in the area should they require any form of reinforcements. The rest of the many battalions of the 31st Group Army's 2 divisions that were in the area, with its 3rd Amphibious Division further east, seizing Annapolis and the Middle Peninsula of Maryland, as well as elements crossing into the Delmarva Peninsula as well. The forces around the Cap were in a crescent shape from Leesburg, Virginia, to the Potomac on the southern end of the metro area of the Cap City itself, all gradually moving in, pushing deeper and deeper into the metro area. The massive artillery brought to bear, and even armor support, with each division having its own armored battalion apiece, with tanks, main battle tanks, coupled with all the available air power earmarked to this specific campaign that were in the area, made the city a ruinous heap, not to mention all the firepower contained within each mechanized infantry battalion, including their own fire support heavy weapons companies belonging to each of their respective battalions, as each battalion was made up of 8 companies, which added to the pandemonium steadily unfolding thus far. By far, the eastern suburbs and eastern part of the Cap City proper were struck by the most ordnances delivered by humongous artillery barrages, coupled with multiple precision airstrikes and even carpet munitionings carried out by 3 H-6K heavy strategic aircraft. These 3 of which dropped the conventional equivalent in munitions of what amounted to an elongated Hiroshima beneath the 3 aircraft, as they flattened the eastern portion of the whole metro area. The north of the metro area had largely fallen in terms of the suburbs themselves, with very small resistance remaining and being gradually mopped up bit by bit. The Northwest had begun to fall as well by the end of day one, pushing surviving forces from those suburbs into the recently established 1st American Defense Line. Behind that were 2 more that were developed, by far with the 2nd being the most formidable of the three, as it had more time to become developed as opposed to the first, with the third essentially becoming a sort of last stand defensive line. Although close to the second in terms of its overall setup, being that it was the last, overcoming it left nothing to remain to slow down the onslaught. Private Lee Chung and Private Quing, along with their sergeant and the rest of their dismounted squad, were now beginning to clear the way out in a 200-meter semicircle from the bridgehead that they'd just captured as ordered by the company captain and passed on down the line. 3 American javelin-wielding troops and one with a tow anti-tank system on a tripod had moved out of the immediate area, having had survived the initial PLA onslaught that was forced upon them just a little earlier, while the rest of the forces were largely annihilated on the Anacostia River's west bank in Silver Spring, while trying to escape a pocket that had been created by 5 different battalions striking deep into the city within this particular area, in the metro areas north and northeast. Most likely, the Chi-Coms had deduced correctly that this moderately sized force of some nearly 400 mixed military forces encountered here were attempting to slip deeper into the city, falling back to some form of a defense line, leading company elements of 2 other battalions in the area, which were mechanized infantry forces, pushed in as far as breaching the city limits of the cap itself on day 1 before finally meeting stiff resistance. These 2 battalions were those which the battalion Lee was a part of was tasked to cross the river to link up with, to close the pocket in. And essentially, this had all been but achieved, as only now less than 1 city block lay between Lee's company and others of his battalion, now that the bridge was secure and being crossed, with meeting up with the other 2 battalions further to the west. However, within this tiny half-kilometer of unoccupied turf as of yet, laying between the 2 other battalions and Lee's battalion, was now to be cleared out by his company of his battalion for the official link-up with elements of the 2 other battalions. Though laying in this area, within basements and rubbled buildings, were the small band of American anti-tank forces who escaped death in the earlier bridge battle. They were in no position to pick off Chi-Com vehicles that were now crossing the bridge, but they correctly anticipated their arrival to meet the other Chi-Coms on the aforementioned 500 meters of empty street straight ahead from the bridge upon the same street. Private Lee began to push out down the street as his platoon of his company was tasked with pushing forward on the street of which the bridge was also a part. There was strewn rubble everywhere, as far as the eye could see. Private Lee remembered his so-called weekend liberties he and his comrades would be allowed to take every so often to explore the city just prior to the war and live off the local economy by shopping among the same people they'd be destroying during a future invasion. He met women there, or here, although he never slept with them so as not to cheat on his wife, of which he had a family with. No, Lee was merely lonely, being deployed for many months in the enemy's land as a Trojan force. All part of the job of being a PLA soldier. It all looked strikingly different as the city had been gutted to its very core, with very little of it remaining still intact. He would be hard-pressed to find anything that was still completely untouched overall. Private Lee, how are your ribs? Tell me if you have problems or pain to where it could slow you down and put us all in danger. I need you to look sharp. This stretch of street hasn't been cleared yet, and we have to clear it and make contact with several companies belonging to the 2 southbound battalions further to our west. Roger, Sergeant, was all Lee replied in response, with Private Quing actually walking up and slapping him in the back before saying, Private Lee is all right, Sergeant, saying it almost jovially in typical Quing fashion. Being younger and more immature, despite being a relatively proficient and disciplined combat soldier. Private Quing, get your ass back in formation! We're moving out, now! Snapped the squad sergeant, almost annoyed by his immature behavior during this time. Roger, Sergeant, replied Quing, as he fell back into the staggered column formation, now proceeding down the street. Moving down the very middle of the street for the ability for a more simplified viewing for the 360-degree mutual fire support security of the platoon. So if any trouble appeared from any side of the street, or even both, they could respond adequately with proper line of sight on targets posted up in all the different rubble. The vehicles were still crossing the bridge of the whole company and other companies overall, with some of the already leading vehicles across being some of the platoon's armor personnel carriers and few infantry fighting vehicles as well belonging to the platoon of which Lee was in, who were now beginning to cautiously follow the troops down the somewhat more narrowed boulevard, now littered with rubble piles protruding from both sides of the street. The vehicles stayed some 150 meters behind the platoon Private Lee belonged to within his company, to act as mobile fire support while simultaneously staying back a ways so as to avoid potential ambush from any potential anti-tank weapons. As in an urban warfare situation, this remained a perilous looming threat within an environment such as this, whereby possible death always lay around the corner, any corner within any such city. For the time being, as was done earlier at the bridge battle, the infantry dismounts were clearing the way ahead for any possible anti-tank weapons and their operators. The other positive, as it related to the PLA vehicles, was many were up-armored with applique armor or explosive reactive armor kits to give them added protection due to the current urban missions currently being conducted. This was also due to the commonality of anti-tank weapons. Certainly, this improved overall survivability, but it wasn't always foolproof. Certain weapons, depending on where they actually struck in a vehicle, would annihilate APCs with very little issue. But the infantry fighting vehicles were certainly a very dangerous type of armored vehicle on the modern battlefield. While not quite a tank, but extremely well armed, and also very well armored when all things were considered. As in, considering what they actually were as a vehicle, they were somewhere between an armored personnel carrier and a tank in terms of their armor and weaponry. Contact right! One PLA soldier dropped upon being smacked in the face, neck, and arms, as well as body armor, with the rounds, which the rounds couldn't penetrate insofar as the body armor. Nonetheless, the well-aimed shots first fired smacked the man in the right places, cutting him down instantaneously, as the other soldiers returned fire with extreme prejudice, including hand grenades and barrel-launched grenades from beneath certain rifles. Soon, the armor personnel carrier gunners from the vehicles right behind them, as well as a single ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicle, laid down savage fire on both sides of the rubbled street, hitting the rubble hard from the angles of fire that were actually available to them from behind the troops, where the vehicles now sat currently. Soon thereafter, Lee felt several rounds zing by him as he and the others dropped into kneeling positions. Then some dropped into the prone position upon seeing tracers flying out of holes that were the basement windows of some of the smashed former buildings. This minimized their signature and silhouette to a minuscule angle from being on the street, making those in the prone exceedingly difficult to hit from these windows. Lee tossed a grenade from his kneeling position just before dropping to his stomach in the prone position. He watched as it flew into the top of one of the former windows that had fire emerging from it, then dropped to the ledge of the window before falling into the basement after rolling a few inches before falling through the hole, with a blast occurring. All of this happening within a mere 5 seconds. The average time that it takes for your typical grenade to detonate. He didn't know if he got a kill with it or if the enemy had already moved on to other positions upon him tossing. But it was now established that they were primarily in the former basements and other positions within the naturally made concaved rubble from the earlier destruction of the area, making them exceedingly hard at first to spot. Some 7 or so enemies ambushed them while they were in the street. Survivors of the bridge battle who had fallen back to this area to avoid the heavy mortaring from the fire support company's PLL-05 mortar/assault guns, alongside the APC and IFV strikes from Lee's company, which had all been working in tandem. Thus, having set up this deadly affair, though small scale it was. Soon, though, it became deadlier, as the one-toe system had been hidden higher up in one of the rubble piles, placed between 2 structural support beams protruding from the rubble of one of the former buildings, currently having been camouflaged by a piece of tan-colored tarp that was found amid the destroyed area around this particular street, likely even in one of the former basements. It now was fired as the tarp was quickly yanked down, revealing the tow system by a different man, alongside the system's tow operator. The man who pulled the tarp was lit up instantly. Although wearing armor, he fell down, badly injured, though not KIA'd. The tow operator got one of the APCs in his identification monitor and fired the tow missile, scoring a direct hit at a top-down angle, killing instantly the vehicle's driver and gunner, blasting out flaps of metal from the engine compartment and also from other parts of the vehicle's armor itself, tossed in numerous directions, leaving a dead, smoking hulk of metal sitting there, annihilated, sitting in the street as dead weight in more ways than just one. Another American anticipated that their ambush was soon to fail, decided to fire his javelin from another one of these basement windows from beneath the ground, and managed to score a direct hit on the one ZBD-04 that was behind the forces of infantry that were dismounted in this street. Although the explosive reactive armor did foil the missile, causing the ZBD-04 to respond by lobbing a 100 millimeter shell into the area where the javelin had been fired from. The ZBD-04 had a laser as well as infrared warning receiver system, by which any lasing system or any system using infrared homing could be triangulated with the vehicle's millimeter wave radar Doppler system on the ZBD-04, including ATGMs and other weapon systems, which would allow the vehicle's gunner to return fire in the direction of the strike. The man in that basement had been blasted into many pieces. As the shell hit the basement's wall around the window frame and crashed into and blasted within the basement just as the shell ignited from impact. The skirmish wasn't quite over yet, however, as the 2 other javelin men that remained were still on the loose, unbeknownst to the Chi-Coms. One of the others fired from yet another basement, hitting the same infantry fighting vehicle as before, and hitting it again, although hitting other plates of explosive reactive armor. But the two-hit combo on the same vehicle did manage to horribly damage the armor that was beneath the explosive reactive armor, causing massive denting. And it appeared that had one more hit in any of the two specific areas happened, it could have been the death blow on that vehicle. It was incumbent upon Lee's squad to hunt down and clear this whole area of the last of these dangerous enemies, assuming that there were any more anti-tank weapon operators, merely due to the danger posed by just them alone. This was a small taste of how the three defense lines would shape up to be, albeit on a larger scale than this tiny skirmish. Private Lee, with his last few grenades, along with others of the platoon, went to each window or ground opening of rubble, and they tossed grenades into each of those areas, as well as others firing their rifles into same said areas, or even machine guns wielded by the squad light machine gunners into the openings. The platoon had broken into two squads, one on each side of the street now, trying to thoroughly clear each side and fast. The forward squad that was on the southern side of the street charged up the pile of rubble of the former four-floor quasi-commercial structure before tossing several hand grenades into the area where the tow system was deployed, all around the same time. All blasted before that squad charged even higher up the pile, finding the man that was earlier hit, that was lit up in the armor, who was now KIA'd from the tossed grenades, pieces of him still remaining, with others gone entirely. The tow operator perished while apparently trying to flee down the other side of the rubbled structure, caught by the grenade shrapnel. This entire very short skirmish, lasting merely 10 total minutes, was now over with. Only 10 minutes had elapsed, and all of this had gone on. Lee's company, one of the 8 that comprised his battalion, officially had its very first vehicle loss within this skirmish. One of the Type 63 APCs of his company was now out of commission, with 3 KIA'd troops and 4 who were wounded in action. 2 of the KIA'd were the driver and gunner of the lost vehicle, and the one was the man that was hit first when the ambush began. The 4 wounded were the remaining men conducting the clearing operations. Though not severely enough to be out of commission, the wounded would be bandaged and treated in the aid station before being returned to duty. The remains of the deceased were gathered, along with both enemy and Ch1nese equipment belonging to the KIA'd of Lee's company as well as the Amer1can KIA'd. This in order to prevent any enemies from coming upon them and using them. There was a quick battle damage assessment done as the remains of the APC were incinerated from the inside to destroy any sensitive equipment via tossing in some incendiary grenades to ensure the combat data link and radio were thoroughly melted away. This was merely standard operating procedure anytime a vehicle couldn't immediately be towed out for possible salvage, as it was essentially a total loss from the tow missile. Other companies of the battalion, of which Lee was a part, had also recently crossed the bridge by now, although some remained on the eastern bank of the Anacostia River to continue occupying that particular area and forming a continuous line of forces, as well as the Air Defense Artillery Battalion, who was tasked with holding other areas in the rear for the supply routes for logistical reasoning, for security of logistics, along with blocking other areas of the suburbs, previously helping to block in the now destroyed mixed unit forces previously within the pocket that had developed there the day prior and then had been finished off earlier on day 2, who originally had been on the west bank of the Anacostia at the bridge battle in the early morning hours. Now, the PLA forces in the area, all current 5 battalions that were in the northeastern and partial northern sectors, all prepared to move in further to the south to confront the first defense line. There was a small, protruding, albeit nearly cut off salient occupied by paramilitary alphabet elements of American forces. The remaining battered survivors preparing to flee to the underground, having remained above ground as long as possible in a feeble attempt to try to delay enemy forces in the immediate area, as well as assist in trying to hold open the Silver Spring Transit Station for any civilian refugees and potential fleeing military elements from other areas to likewise also escape the particular area alongside of them. Lee's company now prepared itself to assist in the push generally to the southeast, along with the other 2 battalions originally moving into the Cap City limits itself, hitting the first defense line before the other Chi-Com battalions could arrive to assist. Lee's battalion was to take some of the pressure off of the leading companies at the defense line of the other 2 battalions by adding its weight to the direct southern portion on the end of the battle lines which lay along the Anacostia River. The tank battalion, belonging to the 93rd Infantry Division, as the other units in the area belonged to the 92nd, having had punched through the scattered group of American forces, mostly tiny bands of fleeing mixed military forces attempting to flee south to their own defense lines, although they were intercepted by the mighty Type 99A tanks, their accompanying armored vehicles of their anti-tank company, as well as a few mechanized infantry grenadier companies. The nearly 1,000-man strong battalion of a standard Chi-Com battalion size was beginning to prepare itself to punch a massive hole in the first defensive line for all the other battalions to exploit. Heavy artillery support against the enemy's lines were coming from the artillery battalion of the 93rd Infantry Division as well, largely focused on the eastern portions of the city, including within the Cap City limits themselves, besides just the outer suburbs. The other battalions of the 93rd were pushing down through the streets of the eastern suburbs, street by street, block by block, gradually pushing into this very well defended, strongly held area of the entire metro region, which was actually holding out a whole lot better than most other areas of the city as a whole, while the north, northeast, and even parts of the northwest and all of the southern or the southwestern areas across the Potomac had all fallen by the halfway point of day 2 of the invasion. Now, the first defense line was next to be conquered. By 1 p.m. on day 2, fighters on combat air patrol, namely a squadron of 12 J-16 fighters lacking any air targets due to the USAF being totally neutralized early on day 1, they now began to serve as ground attack aircraft as they strafed the ground with their blasting 30mm nose cannon munitions, as well as dropping 24 200-pound munitions between all 12 of the planes in the attacking squadron, as each carried 2 of these 200-pound munitions, ostensibly for any potential air defense or ground targets, namely hitting the northernmost portions of the first defense line. This defense line rapidly was pieced together by quickly creating hastily erected vehicle barriers made of rubble, but arranged in ways that were fairly easy to throw up in a very short amount of time, as well as integrating all these tunnels and basements and metro lines beneath the city and ruins, and as well as using the rail tunnels themselves for not only safe transit of logistics and reinforcements to the different areas along the defense lines, but also integrating that with machine gun nests and anti-tank positions also. This was but merely the first defense line, with scattered forces trying to hold the lines at all costs, albeit with more concentrated forces behind them in the second and third defense lines. Soon, 2 other mechanized infantry battalions that sat in their positions in the suburbs just north of the Beltway now had moved south to pinch off the salient of the remaining surviving paramilitary of the Americans in the area of the Alphabet Forces, who were holding the Silver Spring Metro line at the Wheaton Station and surrounding areas. These forces were beginning to close in west of the station, whereas the forces that had already been in the area closed from the east. Soon, the forces would be finished in that area as it related to the paramilitary forces of the Americans, as they soon would be no longer able to hold the station for very much longer. They'd been given a stock of primitive AT-4s and even several Stingers, although lacking very much formal training on those weapons. They did their best to learn and learn quickly, despite not being as effective as true soldiers would be at the functioning of these weapons, as these forces in this area were more akin to basic SWAT teams. The original 1,000 men of these paramilitary forces, these alphabet elements, had been mauled by air and land weaponry of the Chinese, whittling away at them. Despite them using the metro line and rubble to their best advantage, the bombardments were simply just too much. In mere minutes, the last forces to go into the metro line would set off Semtex to shut the entrance to the subway closed permanently before proceeding southward to friendly lines. Private Lee Chung received his briefings via radio as his company was once again on the move, now moving into position with the lead forces of the tank battalion to their left, facing southwards. They'd encountered the first defense line itself, the primitive, rubbled, makeshift sorts of dragon's teeth, as they were called, which were essentially anti-vehicle, anti-tank barriers made to impede such vehicles, with smashed and twisted, burned-up vehicle hulks of old civilian vehicles in piles, serving as hastily erected barriers as well. Some of the best engineering was done using small backhoes and other construction vehicles that were still somehow functioning and hidden in protected areas from all the Chi-Com bombardments, along with masses of men with shovels drafted from the local civilian population who were assisting in the hasty barrier creation and construction efforts. Also, where needed, concertina wire was placed everywhere to guard the approaches to anti-tank positions or to machine gun nests. It was all mildly formidable, as AT-4s flew from many different areas, which were promptly fired back upon by APCs, IFVs, dismounts, as well as tanks, and also even anti-tank vehicles such as the ATF-10 anti-tank missile carrier tracked vehicle, lobbing their destructive salvos of 8 Ch1nese or HJ-10 anti-tank missiles apiece, called the Red Arrow, in quotes. Artillery support constantly flew in as well, wrecking many positions in the 1 kilometer deep first defense line, comprised of the rubble canyons of all the former buildings, wherein certain remaining parts, or husks rather, of what were once massive offices or public buildings were now used as strong points in the defensive line, under which the basement levels were used as shelters from the heavy barrages and air raids as well as airstrikes. This was turning into a fiercely contested battle by which many lives were already and would continue to be lost, largely on the defenders' side, but the defenders vowed that they would go down swinging. The company of the battalion of which Private Lee was a soldier in had been made aware that the Belarusian 11th Motor Rifle Brigade had completed clearing their area from the Virginia coast all the way north to Quantico, and now had entered the battle space in the immediate southern parts of the metro area, with 4 total battalions of its 8 battalions and 3 independent companies. We're now moving up from the southern suburbs along the Potomac all the way into the city proper itself at its northernmost battle lines along a thin axis of advance, forming a sort of division between whatever forces remained at the naval yard and also the forces that were trying to defend the cities, or rather the metro area's eastern suburbs, assisting in the attempt to cut off the eastern suburbs from the rest of the city, as this was one of the toughest areas to take, as resistance in the metro area's eastern portions were putting up a tenacious defense in that particular area. The battle at the first defense line had already begun the day prior, on day 1, towards the end of the day. But now, with the reinforcements arriving in several sectors, expanded into a more destructive affair, as withering artillery of all types, mixed with air power and armor and infantry assaults, simply began to take their toll on the number of defenders. The main objective, just beyond the first defense line in Lee's battalion's specific sector, was the Supreme Court building itself, which was to be seized by the PLA just prior to the end of day 2. No matter what it took, the nation's flag and the party flag of the CCP was to be planted upon its roof, with the building being converted into the field headquarters for the Mechanized Infantry Battalion of Lee's, where the battalion headquarters company was to establish itself. To take the first defense line and exploit a breakthrough, the forces of the different battalions would be shifting battle tactics fairly often, mostly to overcome the diverse variety of different types of fortifications, strong points, and obstacles. Lee's company was rotated into battle, replacing a different company that had to be rotated back to the rear to replenish its fuel and ammunition supplies, and also to bring back all of its wounded for medical treatment from the field, as well as the wounded count was also moderate for this particular company, at some 35 wounded of its 140 total men. Only 4 killed in action were reported of the company that was rotated out to be replaced by Lee's company. Private Lee was tired, but he knew, as well as the other troops, that momentum couldn't be lost, and pressure needed to be kept upon the defending forces. They pulled their vehicles closer and closer, and now pulled into position. As Lee's battalion overall split into 2 companies, taking 2 streets apiece as a rotation, on a rotational basis, to be able to penetrate the lines by concentrating a lot of forces into a relatively small area, and to rotate the battalion's 8 different companies in shifts of 2, in order for logistical resupply to remain at a constant as they went down the street in an effort to clear each and every building and strong point and obstacle along these different streets. Other battalions now did similar along their respective stretches of the city. With these battalions rotating their own companies in quite a similar fashion. The noise and volume of fire in this area along the whole 1 kilometer deep first line of defense was unfathomable, as missiles, ammunition types of all sizes, and shell types of all sizes, and rockets, and the airdrop munitions even as well, all made the ground shake and quake constantly. Amid the flying rounds and missiles, and impacting rockets and shells of various different artillery pieces and rocket artillery pieces, with the occasional airstrikes also leveling rubble merely into more rubble. So thick were the obstacles in certain areas of the line. Airstrikes had to be called in upon simply just the obstacles themselves, merely to clear a path forward, as vehicles started to bottleneck into traffic jams due to said obstacles. Lee was once more in position as a dismount, as the squad often rotated positions between its members from the driver position to the APC gunner turret position, and also dismount duties, similar to many squads of infantry in many armies in similar vehicles with similar duties. The squad's sergeant had to yell in his radio headset just so all the men could hear him over all the destruction unfolding all around, as they sat for the time being safely in the troop cab of the rear of the APC, explaining the next move to soon dismount to rush an enemy strong point, one of the American regime's former department public buildings. This would be a hard-fought battle to take this particular strong point on this one part of the defensive line, as this was a massive granite and steel reinforced concrete building of some 5 floors, also with 2 basement levels, one beneath another, that was roughly 800 by 900 meters from width and length of the building, or almost simply a whole 1 by 1 kilometer in terms of the overall size of the entire complex. It had absorbed massive air and artillery strikes, which did level parts of the building, whilst leaving its outer shell intact in most areas, as many munitions ultimately did take a massive toll, but the outer wall of the building materials were incredibly strong, regardless of the potency of the shells. Even were it a nuke used, many of parts of this building would have looked in a similar state. However, all of the conventional munitions used did manage to leave what was ultimately a massively gutted structure, with many areas where walls remained still having holes existing in numerous areas where direct hits on the structure did manage to occur, along with the ceiling of the entire structure basically being nearly totally gone, minus in very few areas where patches of it remained. The men of Lee's company had been briefed on the floor plan of the entire structure from open-sourced previous information on the building prior to the invasion, as well as anything extra that the MSS could discover that was helpful, and thus sent to military intelligence officers at the 31st Group Army's overall headquarters battalion to their intelligence section. The men were told that their platoon and entire company would be entering in two areas of the structure, while the other company would guard their flanks being used in the assault on the defense line against any conceivable counterattacks from American forces who were holding other parts of the defense line, while their company went into the strong point to clear the whole structure. First thing was first. The armored vehicles of the company, of Lee's, would surround the structure on its northeast end, facing away from the Americans' first defense line, on the side of the structure where the building actually blocked the rest of the defense line's line of sight, while the rest would be facing southwest against the defense line, the rest of it, on the street that was on the southeastern side of the building. As it sat, this structure, on diagonal sets of streets that did not face directly north, south, east, or west. Facing southwest on the diagonal streets meant that it was facing into the rest of the defense line, of which this particular structure had become a very tough nut to crack as far as strong points en route to the court complex was concerned. In just this small sector of the whole city. Other battalions elsewhere all had their own subordinate companies, comprising them, of course, had plenty of other different strong points along the defense line to overcome, as the defense line was many kilometers long as it snaked throughout the city and 1 kilometer deep. Upon receiving the briefing, intelligence estimated that roughly 4 companies worth of forces, or essentially in the ballpark of perhaps 400 plus defenders, now inhabited the structure and the immediate surrounding vicinity of the now rubbled streets that were adjacent to it. More precision airstrikes from the fighters that had come in earlier had been called in again, as these fighters returned to their Canadian aerodromes or air installations hours earlier to rearm and refuel and do any needed routine maintenance was it required, as it was now late afternoon and the jets could travel relatively fast from their positions within the southern funnel of Ontario, Canada, all the way to the Cap region. Specifically, the J-16 fighters returned, now laden with many ground attack munitions, of which most were used along with even the nose cannon of 30 millimeter armor piercing and also explosive ammunition to clear a path on all sides of the strong point, in tandem with precision artillery strikes from the large 152, 155, and even some of the few 203 millimeter batteries that comprise the Chi-Com artillery battalions of both the 92nd and 93rd Infantry divisions belonging to the 31st Group Army overall, who was tasked with capturing this metro area. Shortly thereafter, the idea having been thoroughly shortly thereafter, the area having been thoroughly saturated with ordnances, the company of which privately belonged had begun their assault, as defenders outside and around of the main strong point had either all been annihilated or those underground were completely dazed or even possibly trapped under even more debris from the destructive wave throwing rubble in different directions on the area above. The battalion's fire support company of the 130 millimeter rocket artillery pieces, as well as the PLL-05 tandem assault gun / heavy mortar platoon, combined with the two belonging to the 130 millimeter rockets, then began to fire direct support fire at the structure itself, firing directly into it. Just prior to the vehicles of the company of which Lee was a part arriving within 250 meters of the structure, before finally halting their fire in order that they prevent any potential friendly fire incidents. The arriving forces all ran out of the backs of their armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, minus, of course, the drivers and gunners, and of course the few communications forces and all the other headquarters, platoon staff, and leadership, with the combat troops all in rolling T formations to watch the windows above on the other floors, and also to have 360-degree fire security as they rapidly approached their entry points on the first floor of the massive structure. Some squads entered through massive holes in the walls or through destroyed windows, and a whole platoon entered also through the front entrance itself. The company's 4 combat dismounted platoons all made entry in their respective designated positions, leaving only the headquarters platoon of the company with the drivers and gunners of the other 4 platoons to watch the perimeter and guard against any possible reinforcements of American defenders trying to aid their strong point in some form of counterattack against the breaching forces. It was on, as the saying went. The capture of this massive strong point now ensued with a vengeance, as breaching forces shot their way through, both literally and figuratively, cutting down defenders in the rooms that were entered with everything from using light machine guns to rifles to grenades. But the struggle for this massive structure would take a lot of time. And only now was just beginning as Private Lee entered with his squad and now had to switch to night vision goggles with the rest of the troops just to be able to see in Floor 1's dark corridors. As the cyber attack opening the invasion left, of course, absolutely no functional power grid. And of course, all the enormous destruction with it would have also done similar anyway throughout the whole land, even had the grid actually been working to begin with. The men spoke quietly into their headsets and all of their helmets. To other squads and other parts of the structure, a relief on many as their voices had become hoarse, generally stayed so, from all the yelling of the prior 39 hours of the conflict up until that point in time. They began to proceed room to room, initially not running into any sort of organized resistance, as only one transmission thus far came in over the helmet headsets on the radio about scattered enemies in individual rooms near various entry points, and thus being eliminated. And going thus far had been easy. But mostly, sorry, it's my alarm. But mostly had to do with Americans retreating deeper into parts of the structure during the massive barrage of artillery and airstrikes that had literally just occurred prior to the entry of the PLA troops into the structure, including the light artillery being fired by the PLL-05 heavy assault gun / mortars, and also the 130 millimeter rockets being fired directly into the structure from all three of the different combat fire platoons belonging to the fire support company within the same battalion as was Private Lee's mech infantry company, there to give his now dismounted combat infantry forces initial cover to make entry, to force the Americans' heads down, to stay under cover, thinking that it was still heavier weapons of normal artillery system, as after all, 120 millimeter shells and 130 millimeter rockets blasting directly into the structure sounded not much different from the shells of much longer range artillery coming from further away, as the blasts hitting the exterior directly were so close either way that it seemed all very much the same from inside for the untrained ear, who couldn't recognize the most minute subtleties of what different blasts actually sounded like. And within the scope of the heavy combat of the past nearly 2 days, as it were, most of the Americans and even invaders were all nearly deaf by now anyhow. As Private Lee's squad sergeant received orders passed down by the platoon sergeant over the radio, they had made their way down the hallway, broken into 2 stack teams of 5 apiece. They'd remembered to bring their squads 2 ballistic shields for each stack team's number one man in each of the teams, who each had their rifles slung over their backs in order to hold the ballistic shields. With each of the number two men of each of the squad's 2 5-man stack teams assuming the role of the first rifleman, who would diagonally aim their rifles down the hallway from behind the ballistic shields of each of the number one men, as they moved tactically up hallways in like fashion, with other squads of other specific platoons peeling off in the same sorts of stack team order to take other hallways in order to clear them as well. With the 2 stack teams per each squad, each peeling off to clear rooms in each hallway per their team's side of the hallway, respectively. Thus far, most rooms in the sector of the structure on floor 1 that Lee's particular squad operated in had been all but completely empty. However, action was about to pick up for his squad, as forces which had been taking cover in B1, or basement level 1 of the structure, were beginning to emerge from one of the building's many stairwells. In the northeast portion of the city's outer suburbs, in Silver Spring, the men led by Sergeant Richardson reached down the street as the sun began to rise slowly. He and the men turned left upon making the 100-meter-long dash to the intersection of the streets. Upon reaching and turning onto the other street, gunfire ripped the quiet scene of the street intersection as tracers flew through the twilight sky. Go, 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 go! There came a blast behind the rounds, splashing into the rubble and pavement of the street. It was a few of the barrel-launched grenades from beneath one of the Ch1nese QBZ rifles, popping out a few grenades in rapid fashion. They hit close enough that Shrap had caught one of the 10 running men in his right arm and right side in general, with his body armor and helmet fortunately saving his life. Although his arm was now maimed, moderately bad, having been shredded in such a way to where blood now soaked his shredded uniform sleeve. "Ah, son of a bitch!" yelled the wounded man, while continuing to run. All the men, in a relatively short amount of time, had dashed behind piles of rubble and destroyed vehicles, meshed together from buildings that had also spilled into the street and even onto many of the former civilian vehicles that had been parked once along the curb. Many of these splashing bullets smacked harmlessly into the rubble, although one hit another man in the back of his armor backplate area of his IBA vest, which likewise actually saved his life as well, although causing him pain. The men dashed from cover and concealment point to cover and concealment point, one to another, somewhat zigzagging place to place, bolting as fast as humanly possible to make them extremely difficult targets to hit from a moderate distance. They were close now, as they seen signs pointing down the street to the quote-unquote Silver Spring Transit Center and Wheaton Station. There was a single street sign. It said Bonifant Street, amid some flattened commercial buildings along the run. There was now signs of life. This, as there were men in black body armor vests and helmets, khaki cargo pants, and badly dirtied white shirts. These were paramilitary forces, American paramilitary forces. There were destroyed American MRAPs all over the place. Many had been burned out, even flipped on their sides, likely from all the different artillery and airstrikes having been used in this particular area. As Sergeant Richardson had earlier observed the day prior, merely some 10 hours ago, as he had watched all the different strikes coming in from artillery and the JH-7 ground attack aircraft hitting the area of the station. Hard to believe he'd been trying to find a way here for that long. "Friendlies!" yelled Sergeant Richardson to the paramilitary elements in the SWAT gear, as he and the others ran towards them. So shell-shocked were the SWAT gear-clad Alphabet forces, they very nearly opened fire out of sheer anticipation of threats, as their element being mauled so badly caused a level of general paranoia that simply went without saying. "Hurry up then! Our EOD guys had been tasked with normally what combat engineers do in the military. We're gonna shut the door. We were about to proverbially shut the door to Wheaton here as we go underground with some plastic explosives, Semtex, so that they won't follow us down in there on our retreat. We're basically performing a rear guard action here until we try to help everybody get down into the tunnels that we can. We lost so many men trying to hold this open for the civilians and retreating troops, all on orders from the president," stated the man who seemed to be in charge of the remaining small group in this particular area. Sergeant Richardson and the others with him followed some of the paramilitary forces into the transit center, going now to the escalators that led down into the metro line, essentially now into darkened subway tunnels. Sergeant Richardson was now flush with relief as he ran down the non-working, extremely dark escalator to the bottom tunnels that lay at the very bottom. It was barely even lit, mainly by a different combo of candles and flashlights here and there, although there was some sort of emergency generator running that had some sort of red lights operating. It was just so dim that many areas simply weren't even visible at all. And certainly the generator would most likely run out of fuel in a matter of another day, if not merely hours, more entirely. The tunnels were packed with civilian refugees, And ammo was everywhere, all the way to early 2020s, stated one of the paramilitary men out loud to Sergeant Richardson and some of the other unknown mixed American forces of all types in the immediate vicinity, mixed in with the different civilians now taking refuge here, many of whom had already brought blankets and sleeping bags with them, even small tents in some cases, in anticipation for being out of their homes for a very prolonged amount of time. All the forces were told, along with all the civilians who were nearest to the escalator, that things would get dusty in about an hour's time, as the last forces above near the station would be retreating also down into the tunnels, and then the tunnels themselves were to be blasted shut, turning the entryway into rubble to make it extremely arduous of a task for the Ch1nese to clear out all the rubble that would block the whole escalator way, just so that they could come down after them, which would actually take a fairly decent amount of time if effort was to actually be devoted to excavating the rubble out of that particular entryway. Many civilians moved out of the path of the escalator tunnel's entryways, as well as mixed forces who picked up different boxes of supplies as well as ammunition and moved them back about another 100 meters down and away from the former train platforms, ostensibly just for standard operating procedures, if that could even be said in such a situation, especially considering how fast things had already fallen apart by just over halfway into day 2 of the invasion, the battle itself continuing to rage on the streets above. Minutes passed, and the last forces finally came down. And then words were exchanged, likely asking if everybody was, or asking if it was everybody, and then if everybody would move back. And then, seconds more later, "Fire in the hole!" was yelled as a man pushed a button on some kind of black box, obviously the detonation device. Sergeant Richardson and many others now breathed a heavy sigh of relief for the time being. They'd be relatively secure for at least the moment and had to find a way further down the tunnels to reach friendly lines that were above in the city. However, being that his unit no longer really even existed on paper, this would be a time for him and some of the others to rest and to recuperate before heading out after all he'd barely now just survived. He badly needed a space to rest, as it was very dark and extremely overcrowded where he'd come in at. He helped himself to the ammo, MREs, water, and more before moving down the tunnels to seek appropriate accommodations to rest and also tend to his injuries previously sustained the day earlier, as he needed to now change bandages as well, as it generally also stank in this particular area, and too many people took up way too much room. The others with him agreed that they needed to find other personnel belonging to the armed forces and not merely just these paramilitary forces, as they were in a different chain of command, and seek out also perhaps some cots and something besides just mere MREs to eat. If there were still even any longer any cooked meals even being prepared for the service members by this point in time, the men all could walk casually beneath the safety of multiple layers, meters of ground that was shielding them from the ensuing hell that was going on above ground. This, as they moved down the tunnels, passing seemingly 2 whole miles of nothing but horrified, anxiety-ridden, fearful civilians, many simply trying to understand how what began a day earlier was even possible. Eventually, the men would find a military logistical element and, of course, some makeshift underground outposts within the tunnels, all with their own amenities on a rotational basis for the fighting men above who were trying to protect the city. There were indeed different cots spaced out in some of these areas, and simple cooked foods, albeit that were also running out fairly fast, with mostly MRE boxes and cases of water and many boxes of ammo everywhere. Of course, it was all of the standard calibers used by the armed forces. It would do for the time being, as Sergeant Richardson began to lie down and drift off to sleep. He would actually be awakened also in a very short amount of time with a new demand placed upon him, made by someone recognizing the unit patch and also recognizing that his unit no longer even fully existed on paper anymore. It would be new orders to be pressed into service as a battlefield messenger, being that no adequate communication systems any longer even existed since the invasion had commenced. That is the end of part 16. Next will be part 17 and on. Thank you to all who came.